All right. Hi, everyone. How are you? Yay, that's a good response. So you're supposed to be sleeping because, you know, middle of the afternoon is about when I get into like post-lunch coma period. So hopefully I can keep you awake for a little bit. So today, instead of going on and on about the rivers, I wanted to take our river data. I'm going to show you a little bit of the trends, but I wanted to put it into the perspective of nutrient management and walk through it and sort of how what we can see in the river relates back to what we might be seeing, you know, with the actions in terms of nutrient management. Of course, I'm going to do that as 4Rs because that's like the most easiest way for people like me to think about that. But before I do it, I just wanted to briefly talk a little bit about why I'd be talking about any of this in the first place, and it's because of our monitoring program. The Heidelberg Tributary Loading Program has been in existence, as Glenn was saying, for about, I think I'm up to 45 years now. We've been monitoring the Maumee River up here and the Sandusky River since about 1974. This map is showing all the locations where we monitor, so each red dot, we're actively collecting water samples, and we collect them all of the time, as I'll show you in a minute. At each one of these red dots, aside from doing water quality, we need to know how much water is going by. And so USGS is really good at that. And the reason we're doing it is because we want to know watershed loads, which is basically how much nutrient is going past this station at any given moment in time. Okay? And so what you see is we have a lot of stations around Lake Erie. Most of the big rivers, a lot of sub-watersheds. The big rivers we added early on. These three rivers down here are going to the Ohio River, so that captures a lot of Ohio, you can see. We added those in the mid-90s when nitrogen was becoming a bigger concern. We have tributaries around Grand Lake St. Mary's. We added once Grand Lake St. Mary's became a big concern. And then some of the smaller watersheds are our newest additions. And the Huron we had, and then we added back in. So if you went to any one of these red dots, you'd see something like this. Basically a building beside the river that looks kind of anonymous and nothing very fancy about it. But if you jumped into the creek, you'd find a pump. That pump, looks like that, is pumping water into that building on a continuous basis, basically so we can get up the bank. And then we have an auto sampler that pulls water from that flow-through system 3 times a day, all year round. And it looks something like this. It's like a little mini refrigerator. So it keeps those samples in the fridge until we can go and collect them. So when I said that we started collecting samples in 1974 from like the Maumee River and the Sandusky, that means we never stopped, right? We started collecting samples 3 or 4 times a day. And the only reason we haven't collected samples is if something has broken, essentially. There's a little bit of a time hitch in the Maumee where we didn't have funding for a couple of years. But across most of these, we just keep on trucking. So we have some challenges when it gets very, very cold and things freeze up. But usually otherwise we do all right. So every Monday we go around, collect those samples. We bring them back to the lab and analyze them for everything under the sun. But primarily it's various forms of nitrogen and phosphorus as well as the concentration of sediments. I'm going to essentially focus only on phosphorus today, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about nitrate just because it's important. Everybody likes that, right? Okay, so why am I here talking to you at all? Well, it's mostly because there's a lot of attention due to blooms in the lake, right? Especially in Lake Erie, and I'm going to focus primarily on everything that's going on Lake Erie-wise. So I'm sorry if you live in other parts of the state and I am neglecting you today. I do look at other parts of the state, so let me know if you have any other specific questions on that one. All right, so we're doing this because we get these big blooms in the lake. This bloom is made up of a toxic cyanobacteria. We call it algae, even though it's not really real. And it produces a toxin that is bad for people, right? And so we have to be really concerned about that. But what we have found is that the size of this bloom, how big it gets in a given year, is very closely related to how much phosphorus comes out of the Maumee River from March through June. So you can see here, you can see as that phosphorus load goes up, this is 2015, this is 2012, the cyanobacterial index goes up. That's basically that satellite image of the lake, and NOAA turns it into a number for us. Okay? And so this is a pretty close relationship. This is how we forecast the size of the bloom every year. But it also tells us that, well, if we get down here, maybe we'll be at blooms that we'd rather be than if we were up here. So how did we get there? What has happened over time to get to a point where we're getting these blooms? Because we haven't had them all the time. We had them, they went away, and they came back. So if we look over time in the Maumee River, what we see is for particulate phosphorus, which is basically phosphorus attached to that sediment, right, the muddy water, we see a general decrease, right? Well, that's not a surprise, right? What have we been doing over the past 30, 40 years? Well, we've been putting in no-till and conservation rotational no-till, right? That's sort of the thing. So we see a general decrease in particulate phosphorus. I've got text to follow it, and I always forget about that text, but it's always there. But where we've seen all of our changes in dissolved phosphorus, so that's why we talk about dissolved phosphorus so much. In dissolved phosphorus, it was high. It bumped down in the 90s when we didn't have blooms. And since it's increased about twofold, and it's been high. Well, if you look at the concentrations, they're very different here. But we have to remember, dissolved phosphorus is like crop-available phosphorus, right? It is the stuff that's the easiest for algae to use. It's the easiest for crops to use. It's the easiest for anything to use. And you can't see it. It's whatever left behind after you filter all of those particulates out. So double whammy, you can't see it, so you don't know if you're affecting it, and it's the most available and can cause these big blooms. For fun, this does not look anything like it looks like on the computer PS, so you probably can't see any of the actual dots of nitrate, and I apologize for that. But for nitrate, we've actually saw a hump-shaped curve. We had higher concentrations in the 90s than what we've had lately, and we've been fairly, not low, but lower since then. We think that's associated with changes in the nitrogen efficiency of crops. So if you pick one of these things, the dissolved phosphorus is the concern, and that's why it's getting so much attention. And that's why we go to nutrient management. And if we look at where nitrogen and phosphorus are coming from, you're probably going to see this again tomorrow, because I know Paul Gledhill is going to be talking from Ohio EPA. They took our data and they were able to pair it with all the other data they collect to figure out how much of that phosphorus and nitrogen is coming from the different sources. So you can see that 88% of this phosphorus is coming from non-point sources. Non-point sources basically means land runoff, stuff that's not coming from a sewage or a septic or something like that. And that the rest of it is coming from either septic systems or from permitted discharges like effluents from a wastewater treatment plant. So a lot's coming from these non-points. Same thing for total nitrogen. I would say even more is coming from non-point source. And the reason we usually then attribute it to agriculture is because in places like the Maumee River, which I'm showing you here, most of the land that can be attributing to land runoff is agriculture. Right? It's hard to attribute exactly, but there's not a whole lot of non-agriculture land to give us that much non-point source. Okay. So that's where we get into, well, how do we fix this from agriculture and what do we do? And that's where I wanted to get into, well, how do we see the effects of nutrient management, either positive or negative, on water quality? And so this is just from the 4R stewardship webpage, just saying what they all are. And you've heard so much about that today. I'm not going to get into it in a whole lot of detail. We'll just talk about the 4Rs as we step through them. Raise your hand if you don't know what the 4Rs are. Right, see, we're good. All right, so let's start with right rate. So this is a map that is showing all of Ohio from the Phosphorus Task Force 2 report. And this light green color here is 25 to 50 ppm of Mehlich, which is basically maintenance range, right? And I outlined the Maumee River, this is the Portage, this is the Sandusky, and you can see a vast majority of the land and all of those watersheds is really in the crop removal range. And we think a lot of, I guess I should have started with this figure here, we think a lot about right rate because there is a clear relation between high soil test levels and dissolved phosphorus, right? So if you have high soil tests, you're going to have higher concentrations of dissolved phosphorus. But when we look across the state, really the only place that has really high soil test levels is Grand Lake St. Mary's area, right? These are that dark greenness. This is over 75 ppm of Mehlich. And there's a couple of, high points here and there, and you're remembering that this is not always the most representative database. It's only attributed to these funny little areas here. But to me, this suggests we don't see high enough soil tests in the data that we have to say that it's a rate problem, okay? And we can look at it in more detail. If we look here, this is dissolved phosphorus exports. I called it UALs, unit area loads. It's in kilograms per hectare, basically the same as pounds per acre. And what you can see here is the Portage River, here, the Maumee, here, the Sandusky, here, all have about the same exports, right? Which implies that, they're really delivering very similar amounts of phosphorus. If there's a lot of manure and we had really high soil test levels, you can see the effects of that, right? Chickasaw Creek is in Grand Lake, and look how high these exports are relative to those. These creeks have really, really high concentrations. This is showing us that effect of high rates, right? High rates of soil tests means we have high exports. We don't see this level in these guys. But I don't want you to think that we all know Grand Lake St. Mary's has high soil tests because there's been a lot of manure application in that watershed, right? Don't want you to think that that means you shouldn't be applying manure. There's a lot of evidence, especially from Kevin King's work, that source doesn't really matter if you apply at the same rate. Phosphorus is phosphorus. Doesn't matter where it's coming from. If it's coming from commercial, it's coming from manure. The problem with manure is usually that it gets applied at too high rates. If you apply it at agronomic rates, it's fine. Right? That's my only little bit I'm going to tell you about source. Okay? But we do know too high application, we see higher dissolved phosphorus. Right place. Let's talk about that. So if it's not soil test levels, then what is it? Right? If we don't have high soil tests throughout the whole western Lake Erie Basin giving us these blooms, then what's going on? And I'm sure that there's some of you in here who've seen me give the same slide before. I'm going to go over it again, but we're going to go into other details as well. And basically that's that there's some concern that when we switch from a moldboard plowing to a more rotational no-till, we tended to switch to more surface broadcasting with little incorporation, maybe some incorporation, but not very deep incorporation, right? And that high residue is enhancing the stratification of phosphorus in soils. So basically what that would look like is if you collected a soil core, all that phosphorus would be in that top 1 to 2 inches, not evenly distributed throughout that whole 0 to 8 inch core like you would have had when you had that whole plow mixing, right? And that this is a concern because you pair this type of scenario with heavy clay soils where you can have cracking and tile drains, all the water interacts with this top 1 inch and just pumps it right into a tile drain. So what we did is we were like, well, let's go see. Let's figure out if this is actually happening or not. We collected soil cores from the Sandusky River at over 1,500 farms, and you can see we did a 0 to 8 inch core. We split into 2, 0 to 2 and 2 to 8 inches, and we had a 4 increment core as well. Most of what we sampled was rotational no-till. So whenever you hear this story, if you've heard it from me or from Dave before, and you think we're talking about no-till itself, that's wrong. Most of these fields were rotational, right? This is like what you typically tend to see. Some sort of ground working, usually before corn, right? But what we ended up finding, on average, is that most farms are in the maintenance range. Well, that's not a big surprise. I just showed you a whole map that said that exact same thing. So at least our data reflect that. But then what we did end up finding was that about 10% of the farms were a bit too high. They're above 76. So not everyone was within the crop maintenance range. There were some soil tests that were high. But we did find phosphorus on the surface. Almost all of that phosphorus is in the top 2 inches. And when you split it into 4, all of that was really in that top 1 inch, which means that when water interacts with that top 1 inch, it can really deliver a lot of dissolved phosphorus to tile drains and off into, into ditches and out to Lake Erie. So we should be worried about this. But that doesn't mean we should moldboard plow necessarily. So I know this is a complicated slide, but basically it's a slide that's showing some modeling results from our modeling part of our lab. And what it shows is first sediment on this side, right? And there's a whole lot of different management practices, but the one that's circled right here, that's above this line, which means it is an increase relative to what typical management practices are, is moldboard plowing, right? Everything else, whether it's chisel plowing with broadcast or subsurface, no-till broadcast or subsurface, everything else is lower. And so what this says is if we changed everything in the watershed, from what it is now to where we moldboard plowed everything, we see these huge losses of sediment. Well, that's not a big surprise. We know that. We've seen decreases in particulates already. But what sometimes I think gets missed in the story is the other side of things. So what if we started to broadcast? We went from what we do now and everybody broadcasted, because not everybody broadcasts all the time, right? Well, that's where you see these increases, right? This is with the chisel plow, this is with no-till, and you see increases in dissolved phosphorus when you just broadcast. Where we have decreases here is with subsurface application. Doesn't matter what your soil management is, right? Chisel plow, moldboard plow, no-till, dissolved phosphorus is lower. The one that's right here on the line, which means it didn't really change if everything went to no-till or not, is just switching everything to no-till and not changing your nutrient management at all. Okay? So this is important. This is why we always talk about placement. Not just because of stratification, but because we have some evidence from our models that suggests if we have more incorporation of this phosphorus below 2 inches into the soil by injecting, this is injecting, then we'll see decreases in dissolved phosphorus loss. Okay? Right time. Right time is the other part of it, right? And, you know, I'm going to show you stuff that technically shouldn't matter anymore, but if you need more convincing not to go out there and apply right before rain events, we got a couple of examples here. This one is Honey Creek in 2011. I know it says 2012 water year, but that's because that starts in October. And what you see is a lot of rain events, kind of like this past fall. It was rained like so much this past fall. And what ended up happening was it was really hard to find good blocks of time to get out there to apply. And so you can see in red the periods of time that applicators are out putting fertilizer on. Happened to be a couple of times right before some big rain events. These are flow, so you can see the big spiky flow. And then the black here is dissolved phosphorus concentrations. And you can see they increase drastically right after those application periods, right? Now, I know, I'm guessing, that you guys don't think about dissolved phosphorus nutrient concentrations all that much. I think about it every day. You probably don't think about it every day. And so to give you perspective, this number here is a milligram per liter of dissolved phosphorus. This is the effluent limit for sewage, right? So like if you were a wastewater treatment plant and you were discharging in a little bit into a really big river, a milligram per liter is your limit. If you go over it, you get in trouble. And that's for all total phosphorus, not just dissolved. So what I'm saying is the entire creek had concentrations like a wastewater treatment plant at that period of time. Well, that's not cool. We don't want to do that, right? That's a bad idea. I would think it would be a waste of money as well. However, there's a caveat to this. So this happened, clearly, and I'm going to put it into the span of this whole year. So you can see this period of time here. Here's the rest of the year. And what you see is that, aside from these big events, most storms don't go up that high. Instead, they go up to about 0.2 milligrams per liter all year round, right? We get these spiky levels, but most of the time it doesn't get that high. And we can do that for all of the years. You can see 0.2 across the board, 2013, 14, 15. I'd say this is some of that maybe loss of freshly applied fertilizer, but most of the time for those storms, all of the spring, I told you spring was what mattered, March through July. Look, everything March through July gets up to about 0.2 milligrams per liter all the time. Doesn't matter how much it does or doesn't rain. There's little gray spikies back here that you can't see, but this one's really high and this one's really low. Same concentration. What it says is that it's all water. Right now, there's more than enough phosphorus in these fields that can get picked up if water goes across it, and it gets it onto a ditch and out into the lake. So why is that happening? Well, we think there's two reasons. First of all, that all of our phosphorus is on the surface. I just showed you that. But the second thing is that it's too easy for that water that's then on the surface to get to our tile drains because of what we call macropore flow, right? The cracks and the fissures and the earthworm holes that hover right above the tile drains, they're not slowing the water down enough so that it can interact on the surface and pop into a tile drain and get out, right? And it does that over a long period of time. And that's why we can see these losses with storms that are low that wouldn't generate surface runoff off the edge of field normally. So this suggests that there is some legacy component that isn't really legacy. It's not high soil test legacy. It's phosphorus that's there that we're somehow missing that's still exchangeable even if our soil test rates say it's not that high. So this is an active area of research. I'm sure that you'll hear a lot about that some more tomorrow from the edge of field folks. But right time shouldn't necessarily just be before rain event or on frozen ground. It also should be what season is the best to apply in. And so these are a couple of figures. This is also from Honey Creek. It's showing precipitation in red, right, over the year. This is an average over about 20 years. You can see precipitation's low in January and February, usually. Maybe not this January and February, which has been crazy. Tends to increase through the summer and then pop back down in October and the fall. This is runoff out of the watersheds. And you can see it increases to March and then decreases super dry in August and September. You guys farm, you know this, right? And you can take the ratio of these two things. If you do that, what you end up seeing is that this springtime period, right, January, February, March, April, even getting close to May, is when we tend to have a higher amount of the precipitation we get of rain actually running off, okay? Where we have the lowest is in the summer and fall, right? August, September, October. For whatever amount of rain we get very little runoff, which you've experienced, right? So it's like you'll get a 1-inch rain event in September. You won't even get any tile flow. You get a 1-inch rain event in April. It's like, all of Toledo's underwater, right? So there's differences depending on the antecedent moisture conditions in your field. So when would be the right time to apply fertilizer? Well, I don't think the fall is all that terrible, honestly. If we have a circumstance in which rain can slowly infiltrate that fertilizer into the soil, that's going to be it. But that doesn't mean that hasn't had effects, that we can't see the effects of using that fall time and how we broadcast on our water quality data. So what I did was I took the trends that we saw in concentrations. This is for Honey Creek now instead of the Maumee, and I split them up by season. And what you see is that the biggest increases in concentration since 2000 have happened in the fall. Look how big these are compared to, and we've seen increases in every season, by far the highest in the fall, right? And you can see we're up in the 0.25 milligrams per liter range. We don't see that in these other ones. And this isn't because of the influence of some of those runoff of freshly applied fertilizers, or mostly that, I would say. Potentially there's slightly higher legacy losses in those periods of time. But when we take that and we look at it relative to the whole year of losses, what we see is that, well, maybe some of that increase is because we've seen an increase in flow in the fall, during that period of time. We've kind of experienced that. It seems like it's either really dry or you can't get out there, do anything or harvest at all until December. But if we take it and we look at it as a percent, so how much of that loading, that metric tons of phosphorus that comes out in the fall, how much of a percent of that is relative to like that whole year of loading? And you can see that there hasn't been much change. Basically, we're somewhere around 15%. Everything that happens through the fall, only 15% of that phosphorus is coming out relative to the rest of the year. So what that suggests is even with these really high concentrations, there's just not enough water to take that phosphorus and get it to the lake. What it tells me is that, yes, probably fall broadcast is giving us some of our issues, but applications in the fall is probably not the end of the world. Probably a pretty okay time to be applying fertilizer, or phosphorus specifically. Okay, so let's summarize. I said a lot of things. I'm sure you're going to remember every single one of them after I leave today, and especially those of you who've seen me give the similar slides before. For right source, I said basically manure is fine if you apply it at agronomic rates. Phosphorus is phosphorus, right? For right rates, I said soil tests suggest that most people are following recommendations, so that's not a big deal. But everything we always hear is that if we can get closer to the critical limits, that's always the good way to go because we know there's a relationship between soil tests and dissolved phosphorus runoff. I think what that would suggest is that moving towards more precision agriculture, don't put phosphorus where you don't need it, only put it where you need it. And avoid any unnecessary applications essentially. So like if you have a really high old barn area with really high soil test phosphorus, well, use precision agriculture and don't put more phosphorus there, it's fine. Right time, summer is ideal. Kevin King's got a lot of data that shows if you apply after wheat harvest, you really see a much lower losses than any other time of year. Getting into fall is okay as well, as long as you don't get too far into December. Right place? Well, that would be the biggest thing, I think. Trying to get that phosphorus below 2 inches. Do whatever you can to be able to inject. I know that the issue here is the equipment. So if that's a barrier, maybe considering something like a strip tillage by rows and see how that works, right? That might help with some of that precision agriculture as well. I see some really cool research showing that really can get your phosphorus down into the root level and help with other crop issues as well. And I think that's pretty much all I got. So if there's time, we can have questions. I haven't kept track of time at all. And a lot of contact info here if you need it. Real quick question.
Is there, as far as the timing goes, you know, obviously if you apply 24 hours before a rain event, really bad deal. I've seen some stuff come from Kevin King. Bottom line, if you would say 6 to 10 days before an event, does that reduce that runoff amount, or it doesn't matter? It still never really got in there very well, and it's going to be a problem.
That's a good question, and it's not something I don't know if I've thought about that level of detail that much. You know, usually you say you should incorporate, you know, within a week if you're doing any applications. So, you know, I would think that if you're not going to incorporate at all, I don't know. I guess it depends on how dry it's been before and how much moisture you're getting. Probably, I would think a week is a little short. Honestly.
Yeah. Situation. I'm a long-term no-tiller. I love that, and I kind of said, well, before no-till was a darling baby in the 90s.
Yeah.
It's a rebellious teenager now that people want to get rid of, and you know, and it's in a tough spot. So
yeah.
I know you're saying placement, but if you don't do that, how long's it got to be on there before it becomes not an issue?
Well, I think that I would say trying to keep a track of the weather. You know, like try to, like if you know it's going to rain, or it seems like it might rain 2 inches in a week, then I would be far more concerned about that than if it's going to rain like a ½ inch. Right? A ½ inch is probably not going to really do all that much, truthfully. You guys, can you hear the questions at all in the back? Okay, so the question was about how long after application would you need to wait if you're, you know, broadcasting before you'd have to be worried about big runoff events. So that was the first question. The second question was about how like if you, basically it's just a follow up with the same question. Yeah. Anybody else over here?
Yeah. Any comments about fields that have been in cover crops for at least 4 or 5 years where they got the soil biology going and are not applying phosphorus?
Yeah. So the question is about if we have fields that have been in cover crops for a while and there's so much biology going on that there's been no need to continue to apply phosphorus. So that is an interesting question that I don't think has been explored enough. Because part of the issue is that people I've talked to seem to say that their soil test levels just keep popping up. And so I think there's a lot of possible caveats there. The caveats are that it depends on how high your soil tests were to begin with. It depends on how healthy or unhealthy your soils are to begin with, how much of that macropore flow you have, and then how much recovery you've had in terms of, you know, is the better soil structure and organic matter holding back water or not. So, and I think that water, yeah. So, you know, one of the hopes with cover crops and increased soil health is with the improvement in organic matter and aggregate stability that you won't have as much runoff in general because water will infiltrate and be in the soil better, right? The soil itself will be able to hold more water, but that's something that still needs to be investigated. There's concerns with cover crops. Here's the concerns with cover crops, is that if you have all of this residue on the surface, especially if you're going through multiple freeze-thaw events, that it can enhance stratification of soils, and it can enhance, you know, basically dissolved phosphorus getting into basically that surface runoff. And if you haven't disrupted macropores getting into the tile drains, it might not be that much of a help. But your caveat was that you're not applying phosphorus anymore, and that throws a wrench into this type of a reply because, you know, I don't know. That's a good question.
The levels are high, are sufficiently high.
Yeah.
Probably have to hold out for the agronomy people.
Yeah.
We got time for one more. I saw a hand over there.
It seems like, I guess, there's always a question, how do you baseline something like this? If having a field where you have a cover crop or a natural grassland,
Yeah.
and that everything's decaying on the surface, then it would seem like the natural repose of Mother Nature would be to have a lot of stratification, a lot of surface phosphorus. So,
Yeah.
I guess, you know, if you say, well, agriculture's to blame, well, and then if a wild prairie is even worse, well, you know, what's the claim?
Well, typically wild prairies don't have tile drains. So I think that's part of the caveat there. And normally, and what we haven't been able to find it's tough is a comparable soil test between what you would find in a prairie versus what you find in an ag field. So we don't actually, usually in a prairie you measure total phosphorus and all these various phosphorus fractionations. You get into an ag field, you measure Mehlich 3, and total phosphorus is kind of through the roof, but most of our soils have very high unavailable phosphorus levels, so total phosphorus is kind of not that informative anyway. But there's plenty of studies that have shown a good linkage between stratification in ag fields and high dissolved phosphorus runoff. I think our problem is that how much we've altered drainage, connecting everything there. Exactly, yeah. And, you know, yeah, I think that's pretty much the main problem there. But what you've seen is, like, we didn't always have high dissolved phosphorus loss, right? It was high, it went down, and went back up. So there was a change over time. And I like to keep that as an optimistic viewpoint, that we have been at what we would consider to be reasonable dissolved phosphorus losses at some point in time. We should, in theory, be able to get there again. We can't go back to how we were probably there before, but I would think that we should be able to get back to where we were.
The number of linear feet of tile per acre is a number that's been growing, and that's not going in another direction anyhow.
I agree, but our problem, I think, is in concentration, honestly, and is that concentration during high storm flows, and that's the same no matter how much water is coming out. And so if we can control the interaction of water with the source of phosphorus, even if we have more water coming off a field because of more drainage or because of climate change, then we should still be okay. That's what I think.
All right, let's thank Laura for coming.